Hello, everyone. My name is Sharnice Peters. I am a policy program analyst for the Division of Energy Assistance within the Office of Community Services. On behalf of OCS, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar providing a 90-minute step-by-step overview of the fiscal year 2021 LIHEAP Household Report long form. Today's webinar will be presented by Melissa Torgerson of Verve Associates and Dan Bausch from Apprise. Today's webinar is the second of two webinars conducted to review the reporting requirements for the fiscal year 2021 Household Report long form. Today's webinar has four purposes. First, this webinar will discuss the data items needed to complete the report. Second, this webinar will furnish an in-depth review of the report, including a line-by-line look at each reporting item and instruction. Third, this webinar will explain how to report on households assisted in the supplemental CARES or ARP funds, including providing reporting examples. Finally, this webinar will highlight nuances and address reporting challenges or issues. The audience for today's webinar is coordinators and staff who are new to the Household Report long form or who want a more detailed review of the instructions. The Household Report long form applies to all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and select territories, but it does not apply to tribal grantees who instead complete the short form version of the report. We greatly appreciate your time to join us today, and we hope that this is helpful as you prepare to complete your household report for fiscal year 2021. Melissa, please take it away.
Thank you, Sharnice. Today's webinar will be 90 minutes long with question breaks, and the slides and resources from this webinar are available for download now under the handout section in the GoToWebinar sidebar. So you all know the webinar is being recorded and it will be published on the ACF YouTube channel. If you have a question as we're moving along, you're encouraged to ask them by typing them into the GoToWebinar question box. They'll be reviewed and responded to during the question breaks or at the end of the webinar. And if there isn't time to get to your question, we'll answer them via an email after the webinar. I'm not going to walk through this whole slide. As you're going to see, the slide deck is full of really good step-by-step information. Some of the slides are very topical, and some of the slides go into a lot of technical detail. But this is a great place for you to start when you go back to look over these slides as you're doing the report or you're helping your IT folks understand what they need to pull together. This gives you a nice little index or table of content so that you can move through these slides after the webinar more easily. We're going to start with a poll question. Which of the following best describes your role and experience with the LIHEAP household report? Are you a LIHEAP coordinator who is experienced with a household report? Are you a newer LIHEAP coordinator with limited experience with the household report? Are you a state LIHEAP staff member who works on the household report? Are you a contractor who helps complete the report? Or are you none of the above? If you could all take a few moments to answer this, we'd appreciate it.
And they're still coming in, so we'll give it a few more seconds here. All right, it looks like they've slowed down, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results.
So it looks like the majority of folks on the call are people who work at the state or with a grantee and work on the household report, as well as experienced LIHEAP coordinators, and none of the above. So what you'll see in the slide deck, as I mentioned earlier, is a really nice variety of slides at different levels. And so hopefully we meet all of your needs as you're preparing to put together this report. So we're going to start by going through the basics of the household report.
Hi, everyone. This is Dan Bausch. Thanks again for joining us today. The household report, just to provide some background on it, is a historic LIHEAP report that has been submitted going back into the 1980s. It provides really useful information for OCS as well as for stakeholders in the public and Congress about LIHEAP outcomes. And the information that gets reported in the report is something that's specifically required as part of the LIHEAP statute. There are two types of data that are collected, or two populations that you report on in the household report. The primary information you're reporting is on households that were assisted during a specific fiscal year, so households that received some type of assistance using your LIHEAP dollars. And the second type of information you're reporting is counts of households that applied for each type of LIHEAP assistance. The data that gets reported in the household report is used and put into the LIHEAP report to Congress. It's made available to you and to the public in the LIHEAP data warehouse, so you can access and create your own reports or download the data yourself. And it's used regularly to respond to inquiries that come from Congress or the White House. This is an example of how the data in the household report can be used. This comes out of the data warehouse, and this is showing the breakdown of heating assistance households by poverty interval for fiscal year 2020. And so, as I mentioned, you can go into the data warehouse and create these kinds of reports for your state, for a neighboring state, or for the nation. So we want to, when we focus in on the household report, it's important to see how it fits in with your other LIHEAP reports. The model plan is the initial report you do prior to the start of each fiscal year, laying out what components will be operating in your state, what your procedures will be to assign benefits, and your plans for the fiscal year. At the end of the fiscal year, you report information on the funds you had available and how those funds were obligated, average benefits, and the income criteria you used. And that's in the grantee survey, which is part of the performance data form. And then the household report is focused on outcomes. How many households were assisted? What were the characteristics of those households? Did those households have vulnerable members? And counts that applied for LIHEAP assistance during the fiscal year. And then the performance measures is focused on the impacts that your assistance had on those households' energy burden and on their service being restored, or the prevention of their service from being lost due to disconnection or other reasons. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the updates to the household report for FY 2021 reporting. So as you all know, last year, HHS made revisions to the household report for FY 20 in response to the release of the supplemental funds that were occurring beginning with the CARES Act funds in May of 2020. HHS made those changes so that they'd be able to separately identify the impact of the supplemental funds and report that information to Congress. So last year, the report was revised so that each line of the report was divided to have two separate lines. The first line was total households, and the second line was the subset of households that were assisted with LIHEAP CARES Act funds. So you can see in the image on this slide, there was previously one heating assistance slide, then it was broken out to have a second heating assistance line for CARES Act funds only. And then there was a third line that was not used last year, but was reserved in the event that other supplemental funding was released. Next slide, Connor. Okay, so In March of 2021, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 was signed into law, and Congress appropriated $4.5 billion in supplemental funds for LIHEAP. Those funds were released during FY 2021 in May, and a portion of those funds could have been obligated during fiscal year 2021, or could have been obligated later during the current fiscal year 2022. When those funds were released, similar to when the CARES Act funds were released, the Dear Colleague letter HHS sent out indicated that you'd need to track, account for, and report on those funds. So the release of the ARPA funds meant that you may have provided up to assistance from up to 3 different types of LIHEAP funding, or 3 different federal LIHEAP funding categories. During FY 2021, you may have provided assistance with your regular LIHEAP funds, your LIHEAP CARES Act funds, and or your LIHEAP ARPA funds. So some of you may have used all 3, some may have used 2, and it can vary which funding sources you used at which time period. So with the release of the American Rescue Plan Act funds, HHS has opened up that 3rd line that was added to the household report last year. So in the FY 2021 household report, there are now 3 lines that are required for reporting. The first line is total LIHEAP assisted households. The second line is the subset of households assisted with CARES Act funds. And the 3rd line that is now available is for the subset of households that were assisted with your LIHEAP ARPA funds, if any, during FY 2021. This information will help HHS in identifying the impacts of each of those different supplemental funding sources, and will also provide that information to you. So just to summarize, there are no changes to the form this year in terms of how it's structured or the sections. There are not any differences where the form will look different from what you've seen in the past. But for each type of assistance, now the 3rd line is made available and will be labeled as reporting on households that were assisted with LIHEAP ARPA funds. As with last year's report, the report will also be submitted in the OLDC system through Grant Solutions. So now we're going to talk a bit about the data that's needed to complete the household report.
Okay, so now we get into the good stuff. Not that dance wasn't good, but this is even better. So for the assisted household section, which is the bulk of the report, sections 1 to 3, you're going to need the following data for each household assisted during FY 2021. You'll need a household indicator to identify households. This is to be able to unduplicate them across multiple types of assistance. Some of you might be using a social security number. Many of you, however, are using a household ID, as a household can have multiple social security numbers associated with it. The type of assistance the household received during FY 21, as well as the funding source used for that type of assistance. You'll need the household income and size, or in some cases, some of your systems may be calculating the household poverty level when your intake workers enter the household income and size. So you'll need either of those for the report. You'll need to know whether or not there was an elderly member, 60+ years old, in the household. You'll need to know whether or not there was a disabled member in the household, and disabled is defined by your state. And you'll need to know whether there was a child under age 6 in the household. Now, there are 2 optional sections in the report for you to report young children under age 3 and young children age 3 to 5. And so those would be subsets of that child under 6 count. And for some of you, this is a priority in your state and very important. For others of you, you don't report this information. Next slide. Remember that Dan mentioned you don't only report on assisted households, but you'll also be reporting on applicant households. And applicant is defined by the state. So some of you may be tracking every person that sends in an application or requests assistance. Others of you may be only tracking, for example, applications that make it through the process but are denied or voided for some reason. So how you define applicant is up to you, but for each applicant you are tracking, you'll need to collect the type of assistance they applied for and the funding sources used for that type of assistance, as well as the household income size or the household poverty level when it's available for the household. Now we're aware, and you'll see later, that some folks who apply, you may not get as far as collecting household income information for, and so there may be some unknowns for applicant household. Now let's talk about some of the reporting rules for the 2021 household report. So wherever possible, we've put a screenshot here so we can highlight the section that we're talking about. And in this case, we're talking about line 1 under the number of assisted households section. The first line under each type of assistance, in this case, heating assistance, is used to report total households that received that type of assistance from any federal LIHEAP fund. So if you serve people with heating assistance, you're going to include all households, whether they were assisted with regular LIHEAP funds, LIHEAP CARES Act funds, or LIHEAP ARPA funds. In other words, the federal funding does not matter for this line. We want to capture everyone who got heating assistance regardless of the funding source. Just so that you all know, in the highlighted section, it notes that this is consistent with what you were required to report in the past. You're going to count all households assisted with federal LIHEAP funds on line 1. Next slide. The second line is meant to report the subset of that first line that are CARES Act only. So in the top line, I'm reporting LIHEAP base grant, I'm reporting CARES, and I'm reporting ARPA. But now I'm going to break things out, and I'm only going to report CARES on the second line. I'm going to include any households received a benefit for, in this case, heating, that was fully or partially funded with LIHEAP CARES Act funds. I'm going to exclude households whose benefit for heating was paid without any LIHEAP CARES funds. For example, you might have only used LIHEAP or ARPA funds, in which case they would not be counted on this line. The key point here is that the same households reported here need to be included in the first line as well. The second line is a subset of households from the first line. Line 3 is similar. In this case, you're going to be reporting on the subset of households that received assistance from ARPA funds. So in the third line, you're going to include households who received a benefit for heating or whatever type of assistance we're talking about that was fully or partially funded with LIHEAP CARES Act funds. You're not going to report people here who did not receive any ARPA. And actually the line before should say ARPA instead of CARES Act. So this is ARPA only. You're going to exclude households who didn't get any ARPA funds and maybe their heating benefit was only paid with CARES or the LIHEAP base grant. So the key point here, once again, is that the same households reported here in the ARPA line should have been included in line 1. The third line is a subset of households from the first line. So we've talked about this in past webinars, including the one we held earlier this fall or this month. The household report includes a notes section. And if you receive a warning message in OLDC, you can explain the issue in a note. I can't underscore this enough. Feel free to use this section liberally. The notes are reviewed by Apprise and by OCS staff, and they provide really useful context. So if you see something that's a little out of the ordinary, or you do something that's a little strange in your program or not like your neighbors, please use this to provide clarification, especially if you're getting warnings in OLDC. It helps us understand that you've seen the warning, you've looked into it, and everything is still correct, and it explains why you might be getting that warning so that we don't give you a call and follow up. OCS does use the information from these notes in the report to Congress to provide a better understanding of the data. So once again, use it, feel free to use it liberally. Next slide. An example here of why we want you to explain unique program features and nuances. If you receive a warning message in OLDC, this is just an example, alerting you that the number of households you reported for cooling assistance is substantially different from the prior year, and then you go in and you check and you say, no, this is correct. We got a lot of extra funds, and so we expanded our cooling assistance program in 2021, and we saw a large increase in households served. This is a place in the notes where you would write the change in the number of households served with cooling assistance is correct. In FY 2021, we expanded our cooling program substantially, resulting in a larger number of households served. This is important because this data doesn't sit in a vacuum. It's looked at and compared with past years. And if there are sudden jumps in numbers, it's one of the reasons we put a warning in OLDC to make sure, first of all, that it wasn't a typo, but also to make sure you're providing whatever clarification is necessary so that when someone sees that jump, they have context and understand that it is indeed correct. There are two places in the household report when we talk about overall counts where you're going to be asked to report an unduplicated count across different categories of assistance. The first is the bill payment assistance line, and this is where you're going to report the count of households that received at least one benefit used to pay a share of the household's energy bills and utility deposits. In this line, we're not going to include assistance for weatherization or equipment repair and replacement. Then you're also going to be asked to report an unduplicated count of households that received any LIHEAP assistance, and this includes bill payment, weatherization, or equipment repair and replacement. And so you can see here there's an example where household A gets a heating benefit, household B receives a heating benefit and a cooling benefit, and household C receives weatherization. You'll notice that under any type of assistance, all three households are counted, A, B, and C, because they all got some kind of LIHEAP. And they're only counted once each. Even though household B got two different kinds of assistance, they're still only counted once in this line. Under bill payment assistance, we're only going to count households A and B. Household C received weatherization and doesn't count as bill payment, so only households A and B will be counted in bill payment assistance. We're going to talk more about unduplicated counts, but this is an area where some people struggle a little bit, and we encourage you to call us if you need help walking through this or getting your queries right so that we can get accurate counts. So we're going to ask a poll question. It's a little bit of a quiz, so hopefully you've been paying attention. The Jackson household received an initial heating benefit from CARES funds, and they later received a second heating benefit from ARPA funds. Which of the three heating assistance lines in the household report should include the Jackson household? Both the second and third lines, but not the first line, all three lines, only the ARPA line, or I'm not sure. So just to remind people, the Jackson household got an initial benefit from CARES, and then they got a second heating benefit from ARPA.
I'll give everyone just a few more seconds here. All right, it looks like they've slowed down, so I will go ahead and close the poll. and share the results.
Okay, so the correct answer was all 3 lines. Remember that that the first line in the under heating assistance or any of the types of assistance encompasses all funding sources, regardless. So since this person got CARES and ARPA, even if they didn't get from the base LIHEAP benefit, it's going to be counted in that first line. So those folks who answered other questions, hopefully as we move through this this webinar, you'll become a little bit more familiar, and this will become a little bit more clear to you.
We'll also be walking through some examples in a little bit together. But now we're going to look at section 1 of the report and start to go through each reporting item. And section 1 is the number of assisted households. So here's where you're reporting the total that received each type of assistance and the total that received any type of assistance and bill payment assistance. Okay, so these are all the different types of assistance that your report households served for, and we're going to go through each of them. So the first item's heating assistance. That's the first 3 lines shown here. So which households are counted for heating assistance? Heating assistance is where you report households that received a LIHEAP benefit to help pay a share of the household's heating bills using funds that you allocated for regular heating assistance. Now you may have a different name for your assistance. There's flexibility, but grantees have varying criteria in defining assistance as heating assistance. Some grantees focus on the time of year the assistance was provided, or you may have a distinct application process for heating assistance compared to cooling assistance, for example. So there is flexibility, but it's important that the heating assistance is a benefit that's used to help pay a share of bills. There's 2 bullets on the bottom here that apply to only a certain number, a limited number of states. The first is a few states provide what's called expedited heating assistance, so we'll talk briefly about that. And the other is for states that may have provided equipment repair and replacement services that were not done on a crisis or emergency basis. So expedited heating assistance is for a small number of states that do not have a separately defined crisis assistance program, a separate application process, or a separate designation for funds as being crisis assistance funds. These are states that when a household is in a crisis situation, they provide heating assistance in an expedited fashion during the crisis time frame. So if that applies to you, please include a note explaining that you have fast track or expedited heating assistance, and we ask that you please report those households under crisis assistance as well as under heating assistance. If this doesn't sound familiar to you, it's probably because you have a separate crisis assistance component and you don't need to worry about the information on this slide. Many of you may provide equipment repair and replacement services to households. Generally, when they're done on an emergency basis, someone has a broken heating system and is unable to heat their home, for example, you'll be reporting those households under one of the crisis assistance lines or on the emergency furnace repair and replacement line. Or you may be working with a weatherization partner to provide those equipment services, and you may designate those funds as weatherization funds and report households under weatherization assistance that receive equipment services. However, there are a small number of states that report heating equipment repair and replacement under heating assistance because you've elected to do that and designated those funds as heating assistance funds. So if you do that, we want to remind you that you need to be sure not to count a household more than once on each specific line. So if a household, for example, received a heating benefit to help pay a share of their heating expenses, and also that same household also received repair services for their heating system when it broke, you want to make sure that household's only counted once on the applicable heating assistance line and not double counted. And if you have a substantial number of households that received only the equipment repair replacement services, and you've placed them under heating assistance, we ask that you please put a note to indicate that. Okay, this is a really handy slide. You'll see this repeated for each of the types of assistance as we go through the webinar. This lays out who should be reported for heating assistance and some of the important reminders. So many states operate on a state fiscal year that may be different from the federal fiscal year, but it's important for the household report so that HHS can have consistent reporting across all states to remember that you should be reporting for the time period that corresponds to the federal fiscal year, which is October 1st, 2020 to September 30th, 2021. As I mentioned on the last slide, you may provide multiple benefits to the same household if they need assistance multiple times. It's important for every line in the household report, you're only counting a household one time. The same household may be reported across different lines in the report, but on a specific line, it should only be counted once, not counted based on the number of individual benefits that the household received. So we'll go through some examples of that in a little bit. Funds used, if you're a state that has non-LIHEAP funds that you use to provide assistance, or you have state funds that your LIHEAP program is partnered with, it's important to remember that for the household report, you're only reporting on households that were assisted with federal LIHEAP dollars. So those are your regular LIHEAP funds, the LIHEAP CARES funds, or the LIHEAP ARPA funds. And as we went over earlier, line 1 for heating assistance is heating assistance from any of those federal LIHEAP funds. Line 2 is the subgroup that received their heating assistance fully or partially funded by CARES Act funds. And line 3 is the subgroup that received the assistance fully or partially funded with ARPA funds. Okay, now we're going to look at cooling assistance, which is lines 4 to 6. Cooling assistance is assistance that helps to pay a share of a household's cooling bills using funds that are allocated or designated for cooling assistance. As with heating assistance, grantees have flexibility and different criteria that you may use to define the assistance you provide as cooling assistance. It could be based on the time of year that you provide a regular benefit to a household. Could be based on a distinct application process. And as with heating assistance, you may provide equipment services in your state related to cooling equipment, air conditioning replacement, air conditioning repair. And if you're reporting those under cooling assistance, you should include a note that explains that, and you should just remember to only count a household once under cooling assistance, even if they got a regular cooling benefit and they got a cooling equipment repair and replacement. So the reporting reminders for cooling assistance are the same reporting reminders as for heating assistance. Line 4 is cooling assistance using any federal LIHEAP funds. Line 5 is cooling assistance with CARES Act funds, and line 6 is cooling assistance with ARPA funds. One point that I want to highlight here is you'll notice that it says in bold, fully or partially funded by CARES Act funds for line 5, and for line 6, fully or partially funded by ARPA. If you combine these different funding sources to issue a benefit to a household, that same household, as we went over in the poll, might be included in all 3 lines if you combined CARES and ARPA funds to provide benefits. It's okay for a household to be included across all 3 lines in that instance. And line 4, no matter what kind of funding they received, they'll be reported in line 4. Okay, crisis assistance is a larger category on the household report because there are different types of crisis assistance that states have depending on the time of year or the purpose of your crisis assistance program. So we're going to go through these different types and discuss them. So what is crisis assistance? Crisis assistance is LIHEAP assistance that is provided in an expedited time frame when there's a request for assistance, and grantees have criteria that you set for crisis assistance and define in your annual model plans. There's 5 different categories for crisis assistance that are in the household report. There's year-round crisis assistance, winter crisis, summer crisis, emergency furnace repair and replacement, and other crisis assistance. Now, because LIHEAP's a block grant program and states have flexibility, you may have to determine based on your crisis assistance components which categories here are relevant for you and appropriate. Okay, so the main types of crisis assistance are year-round, winter, and summer. Year-round is typically for grantees that provide one crisis assistance program throughout the year, and there's not a seasonal division to that program. Winter crisis assistance is normally if you have crisis assistance that is on the same time frame as your regular heating assistance program. And summer crisis is if you have crisis assistance that's on the same timeline as your cooling assistance program and targeted to cooling assistance needs. There's also emergency furnace repair and replacement, which is a line in the household report. And this is where you would report any household that received repair replacement services to fix home energy equipment. That can be heating equipment or cooling equipment using funds that you've designated for crisis assistance. So normally this includes repairing broken furnaces, HVAC systems within an expedited time frame. If you report information here, we ask that you please include a note that describes the assistance you're providing and how many of those households are included in your regular year-round winter or summer crisis assistance. And in your model plans, there's a question 4.14, do you provide for equipment repair and replacement using crisis funds? So that can be where you look if you're not quite sure about this, and that should be checked off in your annual model plans if you are providing emergency equipment services like this. Okay, so we've talked about the main types of crisis assistance, but the household report also has lines available to report on other types of crisis assistance you may provide that are distinct and additional from your main crisis assistance types. So the main crisis assistance, winter, summer, and year-round, they're crisis assistance to help pay a share of energy bills to, for example, to restore service that's been disconnected or to prevent a disconnection. Other crisis assistance is meant for any other types of assistance you have that don't fit into those categories. It's not meant to repeat the same information, and it's not meant to capture emergency equipment repair and replacement. So some examples are on the bottom of this slide. One example is you may have started a special pandemic crisis program that's separate from your winter or year-round crisis program. Maybe it has a separate application process, or was something that had different income eligibility criteria. You can report that under other crisis and include a note about that. Other examples is shelter assistance, and there's examples from a variety of states. But if you have any questions or you're not sure, please reach out to us and we can review it with you. So here's a picture of what it looks like on the household report. There's two open boxes, and those are intended for you to be able to report on other crisis assistance and to indicate a name for that assistance. If you report here, it is important, as I mentioned, to include a note. And just as with the other lines, if you provided other crisis assistance with CARES Act funds or with ARPA funds, you'll need to report those households not only in line M or line P, but also in the sublines for CARES only or ARPA only. So reporting reminders for crisis assistance. Crisis assistance especially, there can be instances where multiple benefits may be provided. So again, it's important that you have a way to make sure that you're counting households only once. You have an indicator to find a household and make sure your data are at the household level. As with heating, as with cooling, you'll need to report the total that received each type of crisis assistance, and then the portion of that total that received CARES, and the portion of that total that received ARPA crisis assistance. And
So
I'll
now
turn
we
it
get
to Melissa.
Thanks, Dan. We're going to talk about weatherization now. So these are lines 8, 9, and 10 on the report. So in this particular section, or these 3 lines, you're going to report households that receive low-cost residential weatherization and other energy-related home repairs with LIHEAP funds designated for weatherization assistance. Now, these are going to be households that receive assistance, including equipment repair and replacement, with funds specifically allocated to weatherization assistance. As Dan mentioned, many of you have equipment repair and replacement programs in your regular heating and cooling or crisis programs. So these are any equipment repair and replacement in these 3 lines is going to be specific to the funds that you've designated to weatherization. One of the challenges grantees face when reporting on weatherization households in this household report is that some of you will contract or work with other departments in or out of your agency to deliver this component. And so therefore you may not have control over the data or be tracking it yourself, and may not be tracking it alongside your other LIHEAP data. So when this is the situation, it's important that you obtain or have an agreement to obtain household level data from your subgrantees or your program partners to be able to report accurately on these households in this household report. Household level data is needed to confirm an accurate count of households that received any type of LIHEAP assistance, the ones we talked about earlier, where you're going to report households only once if they received any kind of LIHEAP, weatherization, crisis, heating, cooling, any of that. And so you're going to need to have a unique household ID and household level information in order to match households getting weatherization assistance with those that received other kinds of LIHEAP assistance like bill payment. We're happy to help with this. We've mentioned this on previous webinars. We can help you develop a template for your weatherization partners to give you data and make sure you have all the data that you need. We can help you merge the data once you get it from your weatherization partners with your existing LIHEAP data. Please give us a call or reach out if you need help with any piece of this. Similar to the other sections, there are a few key reminders. Once again, households, this report encompasses households assisted during the federal fiscal year 2021. So this is October 1, 2020 to September 30th, 2021. This is especially relevant with weatherization partners and sub-grantees who may be operating on a different program year timeline. So it's important that you're collecting data for households assisted during this time period. Some agencies or grantees give more than one weatherization benefit. And in this case, we want you to remember that you're only going to count folks once per line, even if they receive weatherization assistance, LIHEAP weatherization assistance more than once. If a household was assisted with any LIHEAP weatherization dollars, it should be included in the household report. Once again, this is really relevant for weatherization. Most of you have weatherization departments that combine multiple sources of funding to weatherize a home. And so this is kind of the $1 rule. If $1 LIHEAP weatherization is going toward a household, it should be counted in this report. Line 8 is going to be all households that received weatherization assistance using any federal LIHEAP funds. That's your base grant, CARES, or ARPA. Line 9 will report only those households that received weatherization assistance fully or partially funded by CARES. It's a subset of line 8. And line 10 will report all households that received weatherization assistance fully or partially funded by ARPA funds, the subset from line 8 as well. And as Dan mentioned, because oftentimes people are mixing funds, there very well may be households who are reported on all 3 lines. Next, we're going to talk about any type of LIHEAP assistance. These are lines 11, 12, and 13. And once again, these are the unduplicated counts we were talking about before. Next slide. So this is the unduplicated count of all households that received any type of LIHEAP assistance. This includes households that received bill payment assistance, which would be heating, cooling, or crisis to help pay a share of the bills. Weatherization assistance, whether it's through the weatherization component or it's equipment repair and replacement that comes from the weatherization component, crisis, or irregular. So anybody who received $1 of LIHEAP is going to be reported in this any type of LIHEAP assistance line, except it does not include households that only received nominal LIHEAP benefits, and these are those SNAP households that get things like heat and eat or cool and eat. That's what it's commonly named. And assistance provided exclusively with non-federal or state funds. So if you, just like with weatherization, some of you will have households that come in and you'll give them both a LIHEAP benefit and say utility funded benefit. Because they got LIHEAP, they would be counted in this report for the portion of LIHEAP funds that you spent. But if a household comes in and doesn't get any LIHEAP, they only get your utility funds or charitable, organization, your funds from a charitable organization, but no LIHEAP, they're not going to be counted anywhere in the household report. If you have a highlighter handy, or you have Post-it, mark slide 51 for yourself, because this is a handy slide that will help you do a little bit of validation. These are magic tricks that OLDC looks at, as well as a prize, when we look through and gauge the accuracy of your report. If in your state a household can receive more than one type of assistance in a fiscal year, the any type count, so that unduplicated line, should be less than the sum of households reported for each assistance type. If households can only receive one type of assistance per year, then we're going to expect this any type of LIHEAP count to be equal to the sum of households reported for each assistance type. And if households must receive all heating assistance, or must receive heating assistance prior to any type of assistance, any other kind like crisis, for example, we would expect that any type count to be equal to the heating assistance count. This is definitely in the weeds. So it's a lot to think about when you're not looking at the report, but this is a very valuable slide for those of you as you're finishing up the report. If you meet these criteria, you should be seeing these kinds of results. And I just want to plug here that we have a check before you submit document. I think we have a link at the end of the webinar that has a number of these types of validations so that you can check the accuracy of your report. Lines 14 through 16 are related to bill payment assistance. So once again, this is where you're going to report an unduplicated count, but this time we're not going to count anything besides bill payment assistance, which means anything that was used to help pay a bill. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that for this item, we're going to report an unduplicated count of households that received any type of bill payment assistance. And that means a benefit that's meant to pay a share of the energy bills and utility deposits. It will include households receiving heating, cooling, and crisis assistance that's meant to pay the energy bill or deposit, or households receiving heat and rent payments. But it will not include households receiving only LIHEAP weatherization assistance or energy-related equipment repair replacement, and SNAP households that only received a nominal LIHEAP benefit. So essentially what you're doing here is, if you're looking at a giant data set, you're going to flag every household that got any kind of bill payment assistance, whether they got multiple benefits or not, and you're going to count each household once in this line that received bill payment assistance. Once again, I'm not going to walk through this because it's a lot, but this is another one of those that you should highlight or post it because it's a set of validations that's useful when you are going through to determine whether or not you have accurate counts. So for example, if you did not provide weatherization or equipment repair and replacement using LIHEAP, you can expect that the bill payment assistance should be equal to the any type of LIHEAP assistance counts because all of your households receive bill payment assistance. And then there are two other scenarios here, depending on the kinds of services that you offer or the criteria that you have for services that will help you check the accuracy of your data. And finally, lines 17, 18, and 19 are nominal benefits. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that nominal payments and the people counted in this particular section should be households that receive nominal LIHEAP benefits as part of the SNAP program. The minimum benefit amount is $20.01, and it's often referred to as a heat and eat or cool and eat program. Only those of you that have this separate LIHEAP payment for SNAP households need to report these households in this section. So this is very specific to those states with a heat and eat or cool and eat program. And if you have questions about this, please feel free to reach out. In this section, you're going to report the SNAP households that received this nominal LIHEAP benefit. But we also want you to provide a note in the notes section that includes the number of households served, a program description, and the benefit amount. We don't need a novel, but just enough to understand a little bit more about the program to include in the notes with your data. We do not want you to include households that receive nominal benefits or the heat and eat or cool and eat programs in the reported number of households that received any type of assistance. These households are really only being reported in this line. We don't want it counted with other unduplicated counts. States that provide nominal benefits must indicate that they provide nominal benefits in their model plan, field 1.7a. We're going to pause and take some time for questions, let everybody catch their breath. So Connor, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, great. I had one question a little bit early on that was asking how can you access a copy of the slides, and this is actually a good slide. I entered a text answer to that, but I want to go over it really quick. Somewhere on your screen here, this is showing you how to enter a question, but there should be a little gray box with the drop down that says handouts, and you click that down, and you should be able to download a PDF of the slides from there. So I just wanted to cover that really quick. And then another one was asking, in the sections that we just covered, do lines 2 and 3 equal line 1, since lines 2 and 3 are a subset of line 1? Dan, do you want to answer that? Otherwise, I'm happy to.
Yeah, can you just, stay right there. That's perfect. The answer is no. The second and third line, if you add them together, will not equal the first line. The reason is there's 3 lines, but line 1 is the total, line 2 is CARES subset, line 3 is ARPA subset, but there's no line for just regular LIHEAP funds from your block grant funds. So there's not a 4th line. And because households could receive a combination of funds, for example, if you issued a supplemental benefit or you use different funding sources to provide a benefit, you won't be able to add them up. But there are things you can look at, and we're going to go through some examples that'll help kind of show how you can look at the 3 lines and evaluate if your report is correct based on how you used your ARPA funds and your CARES funds. So I guess let's jump into those examples now.
Okay, sounds good.
And I think that'll be helpful for people. So we're going to go through two different scenarios. Okay, so first we're going to look at grantee X. On the right side, this is a picture of most of the lines from section 1. It's not all of them, but it's most of them, so you could see it easily. So let's pretend there's a grantee that grantee X, they provided 5,000 households with heating assistance using their regular LIHEAP funds. So all we know so far is they served 5,000 households with regular LIHEAP funds, but we're not going to put anything on the form yet because there's no line to just report households that receive regular LIHEAP funds. So we're going to continue and see what else grantee X did. Okay, when the ARPA funds were issued earlier this year, this grantee decided to use those funds to provide all 5,000 households that got heating assistance with regular LIHEAP funds with a new supplemental benefit or an extra benefit using the ARPA funds. So on the third line, we know that 5,000 households received heating assistance with ARPA, so we're going to put 5,000 on line 3. They also decided to reserve some of their CARES funds from FY 2020, and they used them during FY 2021 to provide a second supplemental payment to just 500 of the 5,000 households that had the ones with the highest pre-LIHEAP energy burdens. So we know that they used their CARES funds during FY 2021 to provide heating assistance to 500 households. So we put 500 on line 2. Now we're going to go back to line 1 and look at what we should put in line 1. So their ARPA funds were used to issue a supplemental benefit to the same 5,000 households that got the initial benefit with regular funds. And then the 500 households that received another supplemental benefit with CARES Act funds were a subset of the 5,000. So in total, across all funding sources, 5,000 households got heating assistance. So line 1 will have 5,000. When we look at crisis assistance, this grantee did not use any of their supplemental funds, their CARES funds or their ARPA funds for crisis assistance. and they didn't use any of it for weatherization. So we can go and put 0 on the CARES lines and the ARPA lines for their crisis and weatherization assistance. But they did serve households with crisis assistance, and they did serve households with weatherization assistance using their regular LIHEAP funds. They served 2,000 with year-round crisis assistance, so we'll put 2,000 on the first line. And they served 500 with weatherization, so we'll put 500 on line 8. We know they did not use CARES or ARPA funds, so the households that received those assistance types with regular funds are the only ones who received each type of assistance. When we go down to the bottom to any type of LIHEAP assistance, we're going to need to report the counts of households that received any type of LIHEAP assistance and break it down in the same way. So when this grantee deduplicated their households across each of their types of assistance, they found that there were 6,000 households that received any type of LIHEAP assistance. So we're putting 6,000 in line 11. When we go to line 12, if you look up earlier in the report, you can see that the CARES line for weatherization is 0. The CARES line for year-round is 0. The only use of their CARES Act funds were to provide 500 households with heating assistance. So line 12 is going to have 500 and be equal to line 2. Line 13, they will report 5,000 because 5,000 households received assistance with ARPA funds. All of those 5,000 households received the supplemental ARPA heating benefit. So this is just one example of what your report may look like if you use supplemental funds to issue supplemental extra benefits to households. Now we're going to look at a different example. This is grantee Y. Like grantee X, this state decided to provide heating assistance, and they served 5,000 households using their regular LIHEAP funds. So again, we're not going to put anything on the form yet. Unlike the last example, this grantee decided to use their CARES and their ARPA funds to provide new additional households with heating assistance. So they used their regular funds, and when they exhausted those funds, they began using their supplemental funds to provide heating assistance to other households. They served 3,000 households with heating assistance from their CARES funds. So we put 3,000 on line 2. They served 2,000 with heating assistance from their ARPA funds. So we put 2,000 on line 3. And now we need to figure out what would go on line 1 that received heating assistance from any funding source. So because we know that each funding source served distinct households, in this example, the total that received heating assistance is 10,000 because 5,000 received heating assistance with regular funds, 3,000 with CARES funds, plus 2,000 with ARPA funds, which adds up to 10,000. This grantee decided not to use CARES or ARPA for crisis or weatherization, so we'll put 0 on those lines for CARES and ARPA, crisis and weatherization. But they served 2,000 households with crisis assistance and 500 with weatherization assistance using only their regular block grant funds. So we can put 2,000 in line 1 for crisis and 500 for weatherization, since we know none of the supplemental funds were used to serve households with those forms of assistance. When this grantee puts all their data together and looks at the total number of households across assistance, the number of households is 10,500. So that goes in line 11. And now we need to figure out what would go in line 12 and 13 with a subset that received each type of supplemental funds. So ARPA and CARES funds were only used to provide the heating assistance benefits. So that means line 12 should match line 2 and line 13 should match line 3. So you can see that we have 3,000 and 2,000, just like you see under heating assistance in lines 2 and 3. Okay, so those are just some examples, but if you have questions about your specific situation, please reach out to us and we'll work to assist you. Now we're going to move on to section 2, which is households assisted by poverty interval.
So the information required to report in section 2 looks at the report of count of assisted households by poverty interval for heating, cooling, crisis, and weatherization assistance. And so what you're going to be looking for is the sum of, we're going to be looking to see that the sum of households reported by poverty interval in section 2 matches the total number of households reported for each type of assistance in section 1. And I'll show you an example on the next slide. Grantees, you want to step back just a second. Grantees should confirm that reporting is consistent with the income threshold defined in their state plan. This is really important. So if you're using SMI or FPL, whatever you're using, it needs to make sure that your reporting matches what you've said you're going to do in your state plan. Okay, now you can move on to the next slide. So this is the example that we were talking about in section 1 here on the right. You can see that we reported in the heating section 13 households, for example. What we want to see in section 2 is that across all the poverty intervals, the sum equals 13. So every household that's reported in section 1 under heating needs to be plopped into some category in section 2. And some folks, just so that you know, we know that people may come in multiple times for heating if you do multiple heating benefits, and they may come in with multiple incomes. They may come in at one point of the year with one income and the next with another. And so we always let folks know that they should be reporting the first income that's reported in the system. Next. When you're determining eligibility for applicants in 2021, you all have a few options. So you can use the 2020 HHS poverty guidelines or the 2021 state median income. If a program component began after the start of the calendar year, so some of you may have cooling benefits, for example, that start in April, you may switch and use the 2021 poverty guidelines when these guidelines come into effect, or you can go ahead and use them from the start if your program component starts after the calendar year. So you have a lot of different options, but when it comes to reporting, on the next slide you'll see that there is some specific guidance regardless of whether you switch or what you use. So can you go to the next slide, Connor? What we want you to do in section 2 is we want you to report households according to the income standard used at the beginning of the fiscal year. And this is the 2020 HHS poverty guidelines. So if you change the income guidelines that you were using mid-year, for example, the 2021 poverty guidelines after they came into effect, it might appear as though you're serving some households over the original income threshold indicated in your model plan. So if this happens and you're over the income threshold for this reason, we want you to add a note explaining this. So let me sum that up really quick. Some of you use the new income guidelines that come out if your program starts late, or you switch to the new guidelines as soon as they come out. But for the purpose of reporting, we want you to use the 2020 HHS poverty guidelines that are in place at the beginning of the federal fiscal year. Next slide. This is math. So for those of you who don't like math, this is a good one to highlight and look at later, or give to your mathy people in your department. But basically, to assign household to a poverty interval, you're going to need to know their gross income and the number of members in that household. And then from there, you're going to make sure that if you're collecting income on a monthly basis, for example, you're going to want to make sure that you convert it to be annual gross income. That's a mistake we see a lot of folks make. We see really, really low incomes because they're only using the monthly. So make sure you convert that to an annual amount if you don't already. You're going to divide the assisted household's gross income by the dollar amount, equal to 100% of the poverty guidelines for that household size. And then you're going to multiply the result by 100 and round to the nearest whole number percent. You can use this. This is also outlined in great detail in the instructions. So those of you who are doing the queries or computing this report, this is a handy slide. There are occasionally situations where there may be households with missing income amounts. This should be a very rare exception. When this does happen, the guidance that we give is to report households with missing income information in the highest poverty interval in Section 2. Missing income information must be reported, so the sum of households reported by poverty interval in Section 2 equals the total households reported in Section 1. We also want you to add a note. So if you say there are 150 households that for whatever reason don't have income information, you pop them into that highest income category in Section 2 so that Section 1 and 2 match. We want to see a note explaining that those 150 households in the top section are missing income information, what types of assistance those households received, and the poverty interval these households were included in, which would obviously be the top. So one example that came up after the last training was some of you use DOE rules for weatherization, where you can go in and do multifamily units, but you don't necessarily collect, this means you don't necessarily collect income for all of the units that you're weatherizing. This is a great example of where those particular units where you don't have income information, you're going to still count them in the rest of the report, but you're going to put them in the highest income section and include a note that X number of households were missing income information due to in the weatherization line because of DOE rules, and we put them in the highest income category. Next, we're going to talk. Okay, I'll turn it to you, Dan.
All right. Well, one of the important questions for LIHEAP is how are vulnerable populations being served? And that's what Section 3 collects information on. So here's what Section 3 looks like. It asks you to report information on 3 different types of vulnerabilities that we'll discuss. So the LIHEAP statute specifies these 3 vulnerability groups: households with an elderly member, households with a young child under age 6, and households with a disabled member, which is not defined explicitly by the LIHEAP statute in terms of what a disability is or what a disability member may look like. So states, you have flexibility to decide who you'll count as disabled members based on your own state definitions. Examples include members that have a permanent disability or that are receiving disability insurance. So for Section 3, you'll need to report 4 pieces of information for each type of assistance, each line in the report, and for any type of LIHEAP assistance. And we're going to look at an example of this. As a reminder, in general, the households that you report in Section 3 are a subset of the households that you would report in Section 1, unless you have a program component that is just targeting vulnerable members, for example, a specific type of other crisis assistance. So there's 4 steps that you need to take to identify households with vulnerable members. First, you need to have a process to collect the information during the intake and application period. You need to store that information in your data management system. You need to have an indicator for each vulnerable member type. So a separate field for elderly member, a separate field for marking if there is or is not a disabled member, separate field for young child. And you need to create an any vulnerability indicator that goes across each of the 3 vulnerabilities. And we'll look at that shortly. So column D is the number of households that have any of the 3 disabilities, have at least one vulnerable member in their household that has one of those 3 vulnerabilities. You cannot just add up the amounts in the elderly column, the disabled column, or the young child column, because households can have members that have multiple types of vulnerabilities. So in general, that 4th column, column D, will be a lower number than if you were to add up columns A, B, and C. And we'll see this on the next slide. So here's an example with 4 households, household A, B, C, and D. In the table, the households are going from top to bottom. The households are the rows. And then the columns going from left to right are each of the vulnerability categories you need to report on in the household report. So household A has an elderly member and a disabled member. So in your system, in your data system, you would have a yes for elderly, a yes for disabled member, but you'd have a no for young child. Household B has a disabled member and a young child, so they'd have yes for the disabled and young child columns. Household C has just an elderly member, so they only have yes in the elderly column. Household D has no vulnerable members, no elderly members, no members with a disability, and no young children in their household, so they have no for all 3. The column all the way on the right, the any type of vulnerability, is just marking if they have yes for any of the 3 prior columns. So if you look down at the bottom row, here's how we report information. In section 1, you would have 4 households received assistance because there's household A, B, C, and D. But in section 3, you'd be reporting 2 households for elderly, 2 for disabled, 1 for young child, and 3 for any type of vulnerability, because 3 households out of the 4 had 1 or more of these vulnerabilities. Next slide. There is an optional section in the household report, which is section 6, where you can report, as Melissa said, further on young children households by breaking them down. That's optional, and here's information on that if you'd like to report that information. Now we're going to look at section 4, where we're switching to now look at reporting on applicant households. So applicant households, there's not a standardized definition set by the LIHEAP program. So it's left to each grantee to define what is an applicant household. You should report according to your definitions, and generally this includes things like households that submit an application for assistance during the fiscal year, or households that visit an agency to apply. Next slide. So one nuance with the household report last year and this year is that there are lines on the household report for reporting applicants for CARES and applicants for ARPA, those subset lines, the 2nd and 3rd line. There's different approaches that you can use to report this information. If you have a separate application or a separate process that households had to take to receive a CARES funded benefit or an ARPA funded benefit, you can count up the number of applicants for that process and report that information. But if you didn't have a distinct process like that, you can take other approaches. You can report the total number of households that applied for the type of heating assistance, which it would repeat the same information that's on the 1st line, for example, if there was no distinction. with receiving assistance based on the funding type. Or you could report the number of applicants based on a time period or a time frame when you were issuing benefits funded by ARPA or funded by CARES. So you have flexibility in what to report in these applicant lines. When you're looking at the applicant sections of the household report, sections 4 and 5, and comparing your information back to the information on assisted households, in general, we would expect that the number of applicants for heating assistance, for example, would be greater than or equal to the number of households that were assisted with heating assistance, since households get denied or may not finish the application process all the way to receiving a benefit. There are cases where this won't be true, especially if you provide assistance to a limited number of households, or you may have a timing issue related to your program. So if this isn't the case, we ask that you just add a note explaining this, so we can know that there wasn't a typo or a mistake in your reporting. One important note is that you may have households that received assistance during FY21, so they would be reported in sections 1 to 3, but they may have applied in the prior fiscal year 2020. When you're looking at the applicant sections, we're only interested in people who applied during FY 2021, so you wouldn't include them in these counts. If they applied during the prior federal fiscal year and they received assistance during FY 2021, and you have this scenario, then the applicant households might be less than the total that are assisted. Next slide. Okay, and then section 5 is the number of applicant households by poverty interval. Section 5 is very similar to section 2. You're asked to break it down by poverty level. The only difference here is all the way on the right, you can see there's an income data unavailable column, and that's where you can report on applicant households for which you do not know their poverty interval and can't assign them to a poverty interval. Next slide. All right, we're going to do some final reminders and finish with some questions.
So I'm going to I'm going to do a serious summary of these last slides so that we have some time for questions. There are no changes to the reform structure or sections for the FY 2021 household report. For each type of assistance, you'll still report on the total households in the first line, and then the subset of households that were assisted with CARES on the second. The only change from last year is that now you must also report on the subset of households that were assisted with LIHEAP ARPA funds during 2021 for each type of assistance, and that's that third line we've been talking about. Next slide. The final household report is due in OLDC on December 31st. This must contain final data from your tracking systems and program records. Remember that this household report needs to be entered and saved and certified and then submitted in OLDC, so leave yourself some time to do that. And then also remember that the household report includes validation checks in OLDC, and if you receive error or warning messages that you're just not sure about or that prevent you from submitting your report, please reach out to Apprise. I also want to add here, if you're going to need extra time to submit your report, please contact your liaison and request an extension. Many of you know about the validation checks program into OLDC. If you've done this before, you'll get a warning message when we think there may be an error that you need to double check and correct. If you get a warning message, you check your data and it's absolutely correct, then please add an explanation in the notes letting us know that you have looked at it and you've verified the data. Fatal error messages are a little different. These are data that cannot be right mathematically, and so they have to be corrected before you're able to submit your household report. And once again, if either a warning or an error comes up that you just are having trouble understanding or addressing to move on, please reach out to us and we'll help. After you submit your report, we'll email you if we have any issues or questions. Once we do that, we expect that you'll provide a response and or make any corrections to your submitted reports, and we're happy to meet with you to discuss them further if you would like. When your report is confirmed to be complete, your liaison will accept it in OLDC, and your final approved information will be used for the LIHEAP report to Congress. You can submit a revision later in OLDC if you later identify that a correction or change is needed. This is information about OLDC. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but there are numbers and emails here, including a link to access the site itself, as well as a link to access the help desk. Next slide. These are really awesome resources. I can't tell you enough. Not only as coordinators do I encourage you to access this, but as we saw, over 30% of you are staff or contractors who help with the report. Please go visit these. These are built for both coordinators who have program brains, as well as IT and data, as Jane Blank would say, data dorks who have more mathy brains. And so for those of you who need to look at these resources, these are fantastic, especially the check before you submit document, which helps you go through and make sure your data is accurate. Next. We're going to end with a poll question. How confident? Oh, go ahead.
Melissa, I think we want to make sure we get people's questions first, and then if we still have time, we'll come back to the poll.
That sounds great. Right. Thanks, Connor.
Here is going to be our contact information as well, everyone, just quickly. So one quick question we had here was, are the slides going to be available after this webinar? Yes. Once the slides are finalized, they'll be posted to the ACF website, and that's the case with all webinars that are done by Apprise and ACF/OCS. I'm putting in the chat right now a link to where that would be. Another question, both Dan and Melissa emphasized using the notes section. Can you talk a little bit more about where that is and what kind of things would be out of the ordinary that would require me to report something in the notes section?
Okay, so the notes section is at the bottom of the report, if I'm correct, if I remember correctly. It's one note section for the entire report. So when you do go in and put notes down, make sure you reference where your notes apply to. And some examples of things that you will want to address, any warning that comes up in OLDC, anytime you've had a significant change to a component. So for example, you've gotten rid of a component that you had the prior year, or you've spent a lot less or more money in a particular component. Another thing you'll want to report is other crisis. So if you have a unique crisis component like shelter or something that doesn't fit into your normal bill payment or equipment repair and replacement, you'll want to put that in there. As well as anything when your applicant counts are the same as your assisted counts, or if there's anything weird about the way you count applicants. That's particularly useful, especially when people are looking at that data. It gives them really good context to understand what exactly you're counting when it comes to applicant households. So those are just some examples.
Okay, great. That was the last question we had. So we can go ahead and go back to the poll question. Sorry. Which is, how confident are you that you understand how to correctly complete the fiscal year 2021 household report? Would you say very confident, somewhat confident, not too confident, or not at all confident? And I will go ahead and launch that here.
Your answers to the poll are very helpful for us as we think about additional training in the future. And as Melissa said, if you're having any difficulty with the report, or you just have a question, you want to make sure something's right, you can always reach out to us, and we're happy to speak with you or take a look.
I just want to add that as long as it's fine in your state, we're okay If you want to have your IT contractor or developer or your staff person call us, they're welcome to do so as well. If we send an email response, we'll always CC you, but you can have them reach out and contact us directly.
All right, thanks guys. It looks like the voting has come to a halt here, so I'm gonna go ahead.
Okay, well, we appreciate this. We hope it's made you more confident. And again, if you have questions, reach out to us. We really appreciate your time today and look forward to speaking with you soon.
Thanks all.
Thanks everyone, bye-bye.